Hello, my friends. Today I'd like to talk about two by two genealogy or apostolic succession within the two by twos. So, for many decades, the two by twos have insisted that their organization, their methodology of worship, and so forth has existed since 33 AD. Okay, that they are a direct lineage, an apostolic succession from Jesus and the 12 apostles. And they insist on this. Furthermore, they insist that no other Christian organization can make the similar claim. They insist that every other group is not a direct descendant from Jesus and the 12 apostles. Only they are. Now, they support this argument by saying, look, in the Gospel of Matthew, there's a section where Jesus sends out his apostles in pairs to the Jews. And since the two by twos are also going out in pairs, that's the proof right there. Because if you look around the world, what other Christian churches are sending their ministers out in pairs? Well, you don't really see very many, and therefore all those churches must not have apostolic succession, right? So I know this sounds like an absolutely farcical argument, because everyone who's sort of familiar with the four Gospels knows that this Jesus sending out his apostles in pairs to the Jews was for a temporary mission to prepare for the coming of Jesus to the Jews. And later, when Jesus sends out the Great Commission to send his apostles to the Gentiles, he does not send them out in pairs. And that the book of Acts, for example, is full of Jesus's followers going out in unitary, so solo, in pairs, in triplets and quadruplets, and so on. Whatever the number of how they operate is irrelevant, of course, to the actual message that Jesus has. But for the two by twos, they ignore all this stuff. I mean, just focus on one line in one gospel that's taken completely out of context. All right. So most people who are X two by twos understand this, and certainly even many contemporary two by twos have come to accept that. But though there is still a large amount of contemporary two by twos, especially older ones, that believe in this apostolic succession story. Okay, so in the 1980s, there was a book published called The Secret Sect, which about the two by twos, which provided all the documentation of the origination of the two by twos in the late 19th century, early 20th century in Northern Ireland by a man named William Irvine and some of his followers and so forth, John Long, Edward Cooney, so forth, George Walker. And it's very well documented in this book, but also there's been follow-up books about it, and there's websites. It's incredibly documented that this is how this group got started in Northern Ireland and in that time frame. Okay, so the two by two leadership contemporarily has sort of finally given in, at least not all of them, but some of them have given in to these historical documents, and they have instead said, well, even though it seems like that's what happened, but in fact, the fellow who supposedly started in the late 19th century, William Irvine, he actually learned of the two by two method of worship from some other people who in Switzerland or whatever, who are hiding in the mountains or whatever. And those people can trace their lineage to some other group in who knows where, Armenia, and anything goes all the way back to Jesus, of course. It's all turtles all the way down. So, and of course, do they have any documentation for any of this, any proof of this? None whatsoever. Just as they had no proof that they were, all the way back to Jesus before this secret sect book came out and proved otherwise. No, they have made a claim that they have apostolic succession without providing any documentation, and it's up to you to prove otherwise, right? So they've made a claim which is you know, it's almost unfalsifiable, meaning like it's almost impossible to prove that they don't have apostolic succession, assuming that you assume they had apostolic succession, right? Which is sort of bizarre because why don't you do that with every other group and say every other group has apostolic succession and then try to prove that they don't, right? That's not how it's a bizarre thing. So it's like it's the whole idea of like proving a negative, right? It's really not possible. But we can but there are some pretty strong evidence in proving a negative for the 2 by 2. So let's get into it. The first is there actually are some other churches which claim apostolic succession. You may have heard of the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches, right? Even the Lutheran Church and the Anglican church claims apostolic succession, meaning straight back to Jesus's apostles. And you may say, well, it doesn't look like it, and blah 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 blah. The thing is, what's apostolic succession means? It means that one of Jesus's apostles anointed someone else to take their position. Means basically a new apostle, so to speak, and that person then in sequence anointed another person, and so forth. And this is traced through time and it's documented through time, right? And it's true that the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, by the way, they were one church until they were split in the 11th century. But they do have extensive documentation of this apostolic succession. And of course, the Lutheran Church, which is a splinter group of the Roman Catholic Church, and the Anglican Church, which is a splinter group of the Roman Catholic Church, also have that apostolic succession. But there are, of course, thousands of other churches that have been created, particularly in the United States, which are created straight out of nothing, right? So Pentecostals and stuff like this, which obviously do not have apostolic succession. And these groups, they acknowledge that and they call themselves restorationist movements, meaning that the original church founded by Jesus was it died out, and this corrupt thing was put in its place, which was the Roman Catholic Church, of course, and that this group, the Pentecostals, for example, or there's hundreds of thousands, there's thousands of others with the same argument that they are restoring things to the way they were in the early church, meaning like the New Testament church that's described in the New Testament, particularly the Book of Acts and the Paul's epistles. Okay, so the 2 by 2s, if you really push them hard and hard and hard, they may admit that they too are a restorative church. Okay, so let's just first deal with the fact that the claim by the 2 by 2s that they have apostolic succession through this. William Irvine met some woman from Switzerland, and they met from some people in Armenia, or whatever this crazy story is. It might sound reasonable to people if you don't know any history at all. But even if you just know some basic history about the past 2,000 years, you can figure out that this is totally nonsense. So here's some things to know. After 425 AD, more or less, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Western Central Europe was completely insecure in terms of stability, political stability. It was extremely dangerous. You basically couldn't go on any roads or walk or anything. You would be robbed and killed. Okay, it was basically a state of constant banditry across the whole former Western Roman Empire, and the only really safe places was within walled fortifications. So it may be a walled city, they may be a walled monastery, things like that. So now you know why those places were walled. But as for traveling around, it's impossible. So how are 2 by 2 ministers doing the traveling around and spreading the gospel during those, honestly, centuries this went on like this? Well, they weren't. They would have been killed, right? So the only places where there was the safety to do this sort of thing would have been in some sort of walled compound, which is what was going on in reality with the Catholic Church, right? They had all these walled monasteries, and inside those monasteries is what the monks were copying manuscripts, because manuscripts, they break down over time. So there was vast numbers, thousands and thousands of monks who were copying manuscripts by hand. Obviously, there was no printing presses, right? So if you have copied manuscripts, imagine how valuable they are, because how much manpower it takes to make one. It takes years to make only one manuscript. This is what the Bible would be, right? So how would these 2 by 2 ministers who are supposedly traveling around for 2,000 years, undetected by anybody, get a hold of one of these Bibles? And remember, they'd have to have a new Bible every couple of years because they break down. Well, they wouldn't have them. That's the point. The only people that had these were inside these walled monasteries, which was the Roman Catholic Church. So again, I mean, it's just nonsensical. And even again, back to the conditions at the time, people don't understand what the magnitude of how bad it was in the Western Roman Empire. The city of Rome itself, after the fall of the Western Empire, went from a population of over 1 million to a population of 30,000. It was a complete decay, completely destructed, right? So this is went on any large urban area in the Western Empire. It was a complete breakdown of society, except for in these walled compounds, as I mentioned, such as monasteries. Actually, the monasteries are the things that kept Western civilization actually made it through and to the contemporary era, and brought a lot of these pieces of knowledge and information from the classical world to our contemporary world. They preserved it over centuries and centuries by copying it, and that includes the Bible, right? As we know, the Bible itself, it didn't exist in the New Testament times. I mean, it was put together as a collection of books much later, right? It's in the 4th century, I believe, by, again, the Roman Catholic Church. They were the people who decide what to include and what not to include, and so forth, because they were the people who were manufacturing the books, right? They were copying these manuscripts. No one else had them because no one else had the capability to do this. The idea that 2 by 2s had this capability is farcical. So there's just it's no possibility that they have apostolic succession in that way. So are they restorative movement? That's a more interesting question, because that argument suggests very similar to many other of these Protestant restorative groups. Well, the thing is, if you don't know anything about early history, say 1st and 2nd, 3rd century history, you would be fooled by these restorative movements. But actually, the early New Testament church, there's a lot of documentation about that church that is not in the New Testament, because there are a lot of writings which, for obvious reasons, were not included in the New Testament. What are the obvious reasons? Well, they were not about theology, these writings. These were writings about practical matters. They existed. There's copious amounts of them. They just were not put into the Holy Scripture. Okay? Now, most all restorative Protestant type groups don't even know these writings exist. And the name for them, you can look it up on the internet and get some of these books. They're generally referred to as the Apostolic Fathers or the early church fathers. And there's copious amounts of writings. So just to name some of these Apostolic Fathers, there's Clement of Rome. So he's from year 35 to year 99. He was the Bishop of Rome from year 88 to 99. And remember, the New Testament, it's not even all written within these times, right? Some of it's getting written in the late 1st century. I mean, the earliest stuff is Paul's writings, which I think are in the 50s or something like that. So Clement of Rome would have been around when this was going on. And Clement of Rome is the 4th bishop after Peter, right? St. Peter is the 1st bishop of Rome, then Linus, then Anacletus, and then Clement, right? And this is known from other documentation from Irenaeus and Tertullian. Clement has written the 1st and 2nd Clement epistles, which you can get and read them, and discuss his time with in the early 1st century. Another apostolic father is Ignatius of Antioch. He was from years 35 to 110. He was the Bishop of Antioch. He knew the Apostle John directly, right? He was certainly influenced by much of the Apostle John, and he wrote a number of letters, and these have been preserved, and you can read them. There are letters on ecclesiology, sacraments, the role of bishops, so forth. A description of the church organization in terms of hierarchy and so forth. He's actually the second person after Clement to have mentioned the Pauline epistles. The third apostolic father is Polycarp of Smyrna, right? So he's from year 69 to 155, and he was, his student has written a lot about him, but he has his own writings. He's I think he's known as the author of the fourth gospel. Again, very interesting. There's another apostolic father called Papias of Hierapolis. He's year 60 to year 130. Was the bishop of Hierapolis, which is now in Turkey. And he had in contact with Saint John, and he was a companion of Polycarp. His writings. His major work is called Exposition of the Sayings of the Lord. It's 5 books. Okay, there's another apostolic father called Quadratus of Athens. He died in year 129. He was the bishop of Athens, and he was a disciple of the apostles themselves, and he was appointed as the bishop after his predecessor had been martyred. He has a book called The Apology, which apparently have even been read to Emperor Hadrian. So, and there's a bunch of other apostolic, sub-apostolic literature from that time. What's called the Didache, which is a Greek word, means the teaching. It's a kind of a Christian treatise. This is from early, between the year 50 and the year 100. There's another book called The Shepherd of Hermas from the 2nd century. And there's another one called the Epistle to Diogenes. It's also sometimes called the Epistle of Matatus to Diogenes. Again, it's written about year 130. These are just the apostolic fathers, but there's a whole other list of early church fathers who are a little bit later even. So you can see how things have transpired from the year 100 to year 200, year 300, 400. So you can trace how things, if there's changes or not. These big claims that these restorative movements make about the corruption and the changes, you can actually go and look at it yourself if these things actually happened. And so some of the names you can look up are Ambrose, he's from year 340, Jerome, 347, Augustine of Hippo, 354, Gregory the First, 540, Athanasius of Alexandria, year 296, Gregory of Nazianzus, 329, Basil of Caesarea, 330, and John Chrysostom, 347. And again, there's many writings from these people. So the point is, if you don't know any history, the 2x2 claim of apostolic succession is a big fat lie that you will easily swallow. But if you know some history about our civilization, you won't be fooled. So this goes to the point of the kinds of people who are 2x2s are generally people who are history illiterate, okay? And they have a huge block in their mind that they don't need to know any history, right? They can get everything from what's in the New Testament, not realizing there are other books that were written at the same time that have a lot more information, and you should learn them, right? This is, again, one of these prideful, ignoramus, anti-intellectual types of positions that you see very common amongst 2x2s and other sort of these strange Christian-type movements that have been sprung up all over the English-speaking world. So I hope that's helpful. And if you have any questions, you can always contact us.